December 1944. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, snow falls like silent ash over a world turned white and dead. American soldiers crouch in frozen foxholes, their hands stiff, their faces hollow. It's been 3 days since they've eaten anything warm. Cold rations, frozen bread, bitter coffee that tastes like metal. The Battle of the Bulge has swallowed the horizon. Then, through the wind, a smell. Faint. Impossible. Beef stew. A column of jeeps crawls up the forest road, steam rising from covered containers lashed to their backs. Men lift their heads, disbelieving. The smell grows stronger, real, alive. A cook in a helmet ladles thick stew into tin mess kits, his breath fogging in the air. Someone laughs for the first time in days. Hot food. 3,000 miles from the port it sailed from. A small victory, but one that could save a man's soul. Because behind every spoonful of warmth was an empire of logistics. In December 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor, America was not yet a war machine. It was a nation awakening. Its soldiers were still training with wooden rifles. Supply depots were half empty, and the Quartermaster Corps, responsible for feeding, clothing, and supplying every man in uniform, faced a challenge of scale no army in history had ever met. By 1942, the U.S. had declared total war. More than 12 million men and women would wear the uniform, and every one of them needed food, 3 meals a day, no matter where they fought. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the untold Pacific, the challenge was staggering. How to deliver hot, edible meals thousands of miles from a kitchen, across oceans choked with submarines and skies filled with enemy bombers. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps began its transformation almost overnight. Under the War Department's direction, it became the logistical heart of the American war effort. A vast network of procurement offices, depots, laboratories, and transportation hubs stretching from Kansas to Karachi. Its mission was simple to state, but nearly impossible to execute. Feed the army anywhere on Earth. Every calorie consumed by a soldier began its journey in an American factory or farm. Cattle were slaughtered in Chicago, vegetables canned in California, flour milled in Kansas. But before a single crate reached the front, it passed through layers of inspection, inventory, and coordination designed to make chaos manageable. The Quartermaster Corps established massive supply depots, sprawling complexes like the one in Jeffersonville, Indiana, or the one at Edgewood, Maryland. From there, food moved by train to ports such as New York, Norfolk, and San Francisco. At those ports, cargo officers supervised the loading of Liberty ships, standardized vessels built in record time to carry everything from tanks to tomatoes. Each ship carried an average of 125,000 cases of rations, carefully labeled, stacked, and cross-referenced with a convoy manifest that might list over 1 million tons of supplies. Once at sea, these convoys faced constant threat. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hunting in packs. One torpedo could erase a month's worth of food for an entire division. So the Army adapted. It began shipping supplies in redundant networks, multiple parallel convoys bound for the same destination. If one was sunk, another would still arrive. At the same time, engineers worked to reduce dependency on fragile shipping lines by creating portable field kitchens and pre-cooked meal systems. By 1943, American logistics had evolved into something unprecedented, a living organism. At its daunting core were not just soldiers, but engineers, chemists, cooks, and mathematicians. Feeding an army had become an industrial science, and nowhere was this transformation more critical than in the development of rations, compact, calorie-dense meals designed to survive heat, cold, and time itself. The U.S. had learned a hard, Lesson in the First World War. A hungry soldier is a defeated soldier. Now, the goal was clear. No American would go unfed, no matter the distance from home. That determination set in motion one of the greatest logistical operations in history. And soon, those systems would be tested under the fire of real war. Across continents and oceans, where supply lines could mean the difference between survival and starvation. By early 1943, the United States had turned logistics into a weapon. What began as a domestic mobilization became a global operation, one that would sustain armies across 3 continents and 2 oceans. In North Africa, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's forces had landed during Operation Torch. The invasion brought with it a monumental logistical test. Could an army fight effectively 3,000 miles from its nearest home port? Supplies had to be shipped from New York and Norfolk across a U-boat-infested Atlantic, offloaded at hastily captured ports in Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, and trucked hundreds of miles inland through desert terrain that devoured vehicles and men alike. At first, everything went wrong. Port congestion stranded supplies on beaches. Soldiers ate cold sea rations for weeks. Fuel shortages halted convoys. But from the chaos, the Quartermaster Corps learned. It created advanced depots, temporary, supply bases built near the front, where food could be stored and reheated before being distributed. Engineers built makeshift ovens from oil drums and field stoves from scrap metal. Soldiers called it logistics by ingenuity. The system evolved again during the invasion of Italy in 1943. Here, mountainous terrain and unpredictable weather made conventional supply routes nearly impossible. The solution was innovation: aerial supply drops, amphibious kitchen units, and insulated containers that could keep food warm for up to 12 hours. For the first time in modern warfare, hot meals could reach men fighting in places trucks couldn't go. But the true masterpiece of American logistics came with Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944. In the months leading up to it, Allied planners in London built a logistical network of staggering complexity. Over 2 million men were to be fed in the field, each consuming an average of 3,500 calories per day. That meant more than 7,000 tons of food, every single day. To manage this, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps developed a layered system: base depots in Britain, intermediate depots near the Channel coast, and forward depots established on the beaches themselves. Within hours of the Normandy landings, portable field kitchens were operating just beyond the sand dunes. Cooks worked under fire, heating coffee, and rehydrating powdered eggs while shells exploded inland. For soldiers drenched in seawater and fear, a hot cup of soup became more than sustenance. It was proof they were not abandoned. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, another logistical miracle unfolded. Here, distances dwarfed those in Europe. Supply lines stretched 6,000 miles from San Francisco to the islands of the Pacific. The terrain was cruel: coral reefs, jungles, monsoons. Yet the U.S. Navy and Army managed to build floating supply bases, refrigerated ships, and mobile bakeries capable of producing tens of thousands of loaves a day. The Quartermaster Corps worked hand in hand with naval engineers to create the rolling kitchen, a modified truck outfitted with burners, fuel tanks, and insulated containers. These could travel with frontline units, delivering hot meals even during rapid advances. By the end of 1944, American logistics had become an ecosystem of motion. Ships, trains, planes, and men, synchronized by precise timing and relentless planning. Every biscuit eaten in Belgium or every spoonful of stew in the Philippines represented a chain of effort stretching back to the American heartland. It was not just a matter of efficiency, it was a matter of morale. General George S. Patton himself insisted that an army marches on its stomach, echoing Napoleon's old truth. But Patton's men didn't march hungry. They marched with hot coffee in their hands, and as the war entered its final brutal stages, the system that carried those meals would face its most extraordinary test yet. The winter of 1944 and the frozen chaos of the Ardennes. Every great military system hides an invisible army. Men and women who never fired a shot, yet whose work decided who lived and who starved. In World War II, these were the logisticians, cooks, warehouse workers, engineers, and scientists of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Their battlefield was measured not in miles, but in calories. The human angle. Feeding the front for the men on the front lines. Food was more than nourishment. It was sanity. Soldiers wrote home not about medals, but about meals. Letters from the European front are filled with descriptions of canned beans, chocolate bars, and powdered coffee. A corporal in the 1st Infantry Division once wrote, "The stew came in hot today. Must have been the first real food since we hit the beach." Behind every bite, there was a chain of human effort stretching back to America. Factory workers in Chicago worked 12-hour shifts canning meat. Women in Boston packed powdered milk into tins. Dock workers in New York loaded crates through the night. Most of them never saw a battlefield, yet they sustained those who did. The Army knew morale depended on this invisible bond. Hot meals gave men a sense of home, a reminder of normalcy amid destruction. It's why field kitchens were often pushed dangerously close to the front. Soldiers would later recall the smell of coffee drifting through artillery smoke, a symbol that logistics had reached them. The technological angle. Science of preservation feeding. An army required not just manpower, but science. Food had to survive months of heat, cold, and motion without spoiling. In 1942, American scientists at the Quartermaster Food and Container Institute in Chicago revolutionized military nutrition. They created new forms of packaging: vacuum-sealed cans, waxed cartons, and tin-lined containers that resisted rust and heat. They also developed rations scientifically designed for endurance and compactness. The C ration, introduced in 1943, contained a complete meal in a single metal can. It could be eaten cold or heated over a small flame. Soldiers nicknamed it combat. Chow. Then came the K ration, developed by physiologist Ansel Keys. Each K ration pack provided 3,000 calories and weighed just over 2 pounds, light enough for paratroopers and commandos. Keyes' design changed battlefield mobility forever. Troops could move faster, fight longer, and still eat properly. Equally groundbreaking was the invention of mobile refrigeration. Engineers designed insulated containers filled with dry ice and ammonia-based cooling systems that could keep meat and dairy products fresh, even in the tropical heat of the Pacific. These innovations transformed supply chains from survival systems into mobile kitchens. The tactical angle. Food as a weapon. Commanders quickly realized that food logistics wasn't just about comfort. It was a tactical weapon. Well-fed troops fought longer and recovered faster. In the North African campaign, the British 8th Army, running low on fresh supplies, watched morale plummet. Meanwhile, nearby U.S. units, sustained by hot meals and dependable ration lines, maintained their strength through weeks of fighting. General Omar Bradley's staff went so far as to map supply routes around meal delivery times, ensuring troops received warm food at least once daily. In harsh winter campaigns, calorie-rich meals became as vital as ammunition. Food also influenced strategy. During the advance across France, Patton's Third Army raced ahead so quickly that supply lines struggled to catch up. Fuel and ammunition took priority, but Patton demanded that his cooks improvise. They scavenged local produce, slaughtered cattle, and set up makeshift kitchens in abandoned barns. One officer recalled, "We were moving so fast that the cooks became combat troops. They were feeding and fighting at the same time." The industrial angle, factories of sustenance back home, the American industrial machine became the true kitchen of war. Between 1942 and 1945, U.S. factories produced over 250 billion individual rations. Entire assembly lines were converted from civilian production to military food processing. Companies like Kraft, General Foods, and Heinz worked directly with the War Department to standardize recipes and packaging. The challenge wasn't just quantity, but precision. Every can had to be identical. Same size, same weight, same chemical balance. Inconsistency could mean spoilage, and spoilage could mean death. In Chicago, the Swift and Armour meat companies processed up to 1 million pounds of beef per day for the military. In San Francisco, warehouses stacked crates of dehydrated potatoes taller than houses. Logistics officers calculated the caloric needs of entire divisions as if they were equations. Calories multiplied by distance, divided by danger. From boardrooms to battlefields, logistics had become a second war front. One fought with pencil and paper, boilers and rail cars, ambition and fatigue. And yet, behind every mechanical triumph lay something deeper. The unspoken understanding that food was life. That emotional connection between soldier and supply would define the next stage of the war, when logistics itself came under fire. 5. The leadership angle, Eisenhower's invisible front general. Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, "You will not find it difficult to prove that battles, campaigns, and even wars have been won or lost primarily because of logistics." He meant it literally. From his headquarters in London and later in France, Eisenhower viewed supply as the bloodstream of war. He knew tanks and rifles were useless if the men who used them were hungry or demoralized. That belief shaped every major Allied operation from North Africa to Normandy. Under Eisenhower's direction, logistics became a central command function, not an afterthought. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, maintained detailed charts showing the movement of food, fuel, and ammunition. Eisenhower personally approved supply ratios and even reviewed reports on troop rations. He understood that feeding an army wasn't just about calories. It was about confidence. In one internal memo from 1944, Eisenhower emphasized that the fighting man's comfort must equal his courage. The result was an unprecedented prioritization of food logistics. Portable kitchens, insulated containers, and convoys of ration trucks followed the advance like shadows. Wherever the flag moved, the cooks followed. Eisenhower's philosophy transformed war management into an exercise in empathy, understanding what sustained men as human beings, not just as soldiers. The psychological angle, morale and memory food, affects the mind as much as the body. The U.S. Army's psychologists, working with the Quartermaster Corps, studied morale reports from every theater. They discovered a consistent pattern. Units receiving regular hot meals showed higher endurance, fewer desertions, and lower psychological breakdowns. Hot food became a form of therapy, a momentary restoration of humanity. Soldiers in Europe would often risk enemy fire just to collect rations from supply trucks. In the Pacific, Marines described the arrival of a hot meal as better than a medal. The smell of coffee or stew carried emotional weight far beyond nutrition. It reminded men of home, mothers, and quiet mornings, sensations that war had erased. Commanders learned to use that psychological trigger. Before major offensives, units were often served fresh. Hot meals to steady nerves and unify resolve. Military historians later noted that the consistency of American food supply helped maintain one of the most disciplined and resilient fighting forces of the war. The enemy noticed too. Captured German soldiers frequently remarked with astonishment at the abundance and variety of Allied field rations compared to their own. The contrast angle, Axis starvation, on the other side of the war, logistics faltered. Germany and Japan both faced crippling shortages of food and fuel by 1943. Their soldiers lived on limited rations, often cold and monotonous, dark bread, thin soup, tinned meat, when available. German field kitchens, though efficient early in the war, collapsed under Allied bombing campaigns and fuel scarcity. Supply trains were destroyed, depots burned, and transportation networks crippled. As the Eastern Front consumed resources, Wehrmacht soldiers in France and Italy were left undersupplied. In contrast, American troops were comparatively well-fed, even deep inside enemy territory. A Wehrmacht prisoner captured during the Battle of the Bulge told his interrogator, "Your soldiers eat like kings while ours starve in their trenches." In the Pacific, Japanese troops endured even worse. Cut off by Allied naval blockades, they were forced to forage, sometimes surviving on roots and insects. Starvation killed more Japanese soldiers in certain campaigns than American bullets did. The difference was not just logistical, it was ideological. The U.S. treated supply as sacred. The Axis treated it as secondary. In the end, it was not just factories and fleets that decided victory, but kitchens and rail cars. The moral angle, the human cost of efficiency. Feeding millions required industrial perfection, but perfection came with a cost. The American food industry's wartime mobilization stretched the limits of human endurance. Factory workers, mostly women, endured endless hours of labor. Wartime rationing at home meant that civilians often went without to ensure soldiers did not. Some criticized the system's rigidity, its obsession with uniformity and control. Food scientists, under military contracts, developed synthetic substitutes and chemical preservatives that would later reshape global food production for decades. The war accelerated America's shift toward industrialized food, a transformation that outlived the conflict itself. Yet, for the men at war, none of that mattered in the moment. A soldier didn't taste preservatives or logistics. He tasted relief. The moral tension between industrial efficiency and human comfort was never fully resolved. But during the war, it was accepted as necessary. In that acceptance lay the heart of America's logistical triumph, a belief that feeding the soldier was feeding the fight. By late 1944, this vast network, from factories to foxholes, would face its greatest crisis yet. In the frozen forests of Belgium, supply lines shattered under surprise attack. And suddenly, every system, every convoy, and every cook would be tested to the breaking point. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At dawn, the stillness was broken by thunder. German artillery roared across a 70-mile front, blasting through the mist and snow. It was Hitler's last gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein. The surprise counteroffensive meant to split the Allied lines and capture the port of Antwerp. The U.S. Army, exhausted, scattered, and unprepared for a winter assault, suddenly found itself trapped in one of the coldest European winters in living memory. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow choked the roads. Supply convoys were cut off or destroyed. Within days, entire divisions were isolated. Ammunition ran low. Vehicles froze solid. Soldiers burned fence posts for warmth. The lifeline that had carried hot food across Europe was collapsing. For the Quartermaster Corps, this was not just a setback. It was a nightmare. Supply depots in France and Luxembourg were overrun. Trucks couldn't move. The carefully synchronized system of depots and convoys, the pride of Allied logistics, was breaking apart under the weight of snow and surprise. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded. No road in or out. No chance of relief. Inside the town, 10,000 American troops huddled in basements and foxholes, living on cold rations, sea rations eaten straight from the can, hard biscuits frozen solid. But starvation was not an option. In makeshift shelters, cooks melted snow for coffee. Medical officers rationed chocolate and sugar cubes for wounded men. One paratrooper later wrote, "We were eating like animals, but we were alive." Outside Bastogne, quartermaster units worked around the clock to find a way through. Fuel shortages crippled truck convoys, but engineers began improvising. They fitted half-tracks with sled-like runners to drag insulated food containers through snowbound trails. Each carried enough hot stew for 200 men, if it arrived in time. Then came the skies. When the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, Allied aircraft roared overhead. The first break in the storm. The U.S. Army Air Forces launched massive C-47 airdrops into Bastogne. Parachutes blossomed like snowflakes, each carrying crates of food, medicine, and ammunition. Among those crates were insulated containers packed with freshly cooked meals from rear kitchens, stews, soups, and bread that had been sealed and kept warm using chemical heat packs. For the first time in days, the surrounded soldiers of Bastogne ate hot food. Some cried, others just stared, unbelieving, at the steam rising in the freezing air. Every meal dropped from the sky was a logistical miracle, the product of coordination between pilots, quartermasters, and cooks spread across hundreds of miles. It was proof that even surrounded, even frozen, the system still worked. Meanwhile, along other parts of the front, the Quartermaster Corps began rerouting entire convoys. Trains and trucks loaded with rations were diverted through makeshift routes across France and Belgium. Civilians were recruited to shovel snow, repair roads, and guide vehicles through mountain passes. The Red Ball Express, the famed trucking network that had once supplied Patton's Advance, was reactivated, now carrying not fuel, but food. Every calorie counted. Every hour mattered. Soldiers were burning thousands of calories just to survive the cold. Quartermasters calculated energy needs like battlefield commanders planned attacks. The 9th Armored Division, trapped near St. Vith, survived because a single supply convoy broke through enemy lines carrying thermal containers of stew and coffee. Men later said that meal tasted like victory. Behind the front, in the French town of Verdun, vast kitchens boiled for 20 hours a day, filling metal drums with beef broth, potatoes, and beans. The drums were sealed, labeled, and sent north. Trucks carried them as far as the fighting allowed, where smaller units, often under fire, hand-carried the food to foxholes. The logistics of survival had become a form of combat. By Christmas Eve, the worst of the crisis was over. The German advance had slowed, and Allied counterattacks began pushing back. But the battle had revealed something profound, that even in chaos, the American logistical system could bend, adapt, and endure. Still, the cost was enormous. Hundreds of supply trucks were lost, thousands of tons of food destroyed, and countless quartermaster personnel killed or captured. Yet, the men at the front never completely starved. Not once. That was no accident. It was the result of a logistical doctrine that treated feeding as fighting. And as the skies cleared and the offensive turned, America's invisible army of logisticians prepared for one final push, to restore the entire supply chain from port to foxhole in record time. January 1945. The snow still covered Belgium like a white shroud. The roads were rivers of ice, but the thunder of German guns had faded. Bastogne had held. The line had not broken. Now began the counterattack, and with it, the rebuilding of the Allied logistical system from the ground up. The Quartermaster Corps, battered, frostbitten but unbroken, went back to work. Their first task, reconnect the arteries of supply that had been severed by the storm and the surprise. Convoys rolled again, Engineers cleared roads with bulldozers, flamethrowers, and dynamite, breaking the ice with the same determination soldiers used to break enemy lines. New temporary depots sprang up near the front, collections of tents, barrels, and trucks, where cooks ladled hot soup beside piles of ammunition. At the same time, the field bakeries returned to life. Massive ovens, mounted on trailers, were fired up across France and Belgium. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the frozen air. Each mobile bakery could produce more than 10,000 loaves a day. Warm, soft, and life-saving. For soldiers who had eaten cold rations for weeks, a slice of bread was a taste of home. To speed distribution, the Quartermaster Corps began using supply shuttle systems, smaller, faster truck convoys that ran back and forth between depots and frontline units without stopping. Each shuttle carried insulated food containers filled with boiling stew from central kitchens and returned empty for refilling. It was a constant, tireless motion. Food moving like blood through veins. The new system worked. By mid-January, hot meals were reaching units that had gone hungry since December. The morale shift was immediate. Soldiers wrote home about the return of real food. Commanders noted that discipline, energy, and confidence all rose when men were fed properly. As one colonel put it, "You can't fight a modern war on an empty stomach." The quartermaster is as vital as the rifleman. Meanwhile, in the skies above Europe, the Army Air Forces continued to support the logistics miracle. C-47s and C-54s dropped food supplies deep into forested areas, while bombers returning from missions carried pallets of rations instead of bombs. Each crate that landed intact meant one more platoon could keep fighting. But perhaps the most stunning recovery happened at the Antwerp port. Captured only months before, Antwerp had been rendered almost useless by German sabotage and V-2 rocket attacks. Now, under constant danger, the port crews, many of them civilian volunteers and Allied engineers, repaired docks, cleared debris, and reopened storage facilities. Within weeks, ships were unloading thousands of tons of supplies daily. Canned meats, flour, coffee, and fuel. All bound for the front. Antwerp became the new heart of the Allied logistics network, pumping life into the armies advancing east toward the Rhine. The Red Ball Express was reborn, but with a new mission, not just fuel and ammunition, but food for the advancing tide. Thousands of African-American drivers and mechanics once again braved icy roads, enemy aircraft, and exhaustion to keep the supply chain unbroken. Each truck carried metal drums painted with color codes: red, ammunition, blue, fuel yellow. Food yellow became the most welcome color on the battlefield. Across Europe, the Quartermaster Corps grew into a force of its own. Over 300,000 personnel were now engaged in feeding and clothing the army, from port workers to cooks, bakers, and truck drivers. They were invisible to history, yet indispensable to victory. By February, as Allied divisions crossed the Roer River and prepared to assault the Rhine, the supply chain was functioning with mechanical precision again. Hot meals were delivered twice a day, fresh bread 3 times a week, and special rations, chocolate, fruit, and coffee, were sent ahead for frontline breakthroughs. This was not just nourishment, it was psychological warfare. Every hot meal reminded soldiers that their country stood behind them, that even in the ruins of Europe, they were cared for, remembered, and fed. When the Third Army reached the Rhine in March, General Patton himself remarked, "My men can fight because my cooks can cook." By now, the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge had transformed the entire U.S. Army's logistical philosophy. Before the Ardennes, food was seen as support. After it, food became strategy. Every new operation, from crossing rivers to capturing cities, included detailed feeding plans. Supply officers sat in the same briefings as combat commanders. Portable kitchens were assigned to specific divisions. Fuel and flour were treated as equally vital. It was this meticulous coordination, the art of feeding an army in motion, that allowed the Allies to sustain their final offensive into Germany. Behind every tank, every rifle, every inch of advance, there was a trail of trucks, cooks, and bakers ensuring that soldiers never fought on empty stomachs again. By the end of March 1945, the supply miracle was complete. The American logistical network stretched unbroken from the French ports to the German border. 500 miles of road, rail, and determination. The men who had endured hunger in Bastogne were now marching with hot meals in their packs, their faith restored by the invisible army that never stopped working. The war was not over yet, but the system that would end it was already in motion. March 1945. The Rhine River, the last great natural barrier before the heart of Germany. For months, the U.S. Army had prepared to cross it. Tanks were refueled, divisions were rested, and now even the kitchens were ready. As the first assault boats drifted across the misty river under enemy fire, behind them rolled a supply machine unlike any in human history. Every meal, every loaf of bread, every gallon of soup had been planned weeks ahead. Floating bridges carried not only tanks and men, but convoys of field kitchens, insulated food carriers, and supply trucks. Within 24 hours of the first crossing, hot meals were already being served on the eastern bank. The Quartermaster Corps had perfected a rhythm, supply depots leapfrogging forward as the front moved, mobile bakeries dismantled and rebuilt overnight, kitchens operating just miles from artillery fire. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Yet the cooks stayed. They served meals under shell fire, in ruined barns, beside smoking cities. As the Allies advanced through Cologne, Frankfurt, and beyond, the logistics network became a moving city of sustenance. Trucks carried bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee from France into Germany, along roads once controlled by the Wehrmacht. Each day, thousands of tons of food rolled east, through towns shattered by war, past civilians lining the roads, silent and hungry. Soon, the U.S. supply system had to feed not only its own soldiers, but also millions of liberated civilians and prisoners, concentration camp survivors, displaced families, and German POWs all depended on the same lifeline that sustained the Allied armies. In April 1945, when American forces entered Buchenwald and Dachau, they found prisoners skeletal and starving. Within hours, quartermaster trucks were rerouted from combat rations to emergency relief feeding. Army cooks worked day and night preparing soup and bread under strict medical supervision to prevent refeeding shock. The same hot meals that had sustained the U.S. Army were now saving lives across a devastated continent. The miracle of American logistics, forged in war, had become an act of mercy. Meanwhile, at the ports, the supply flow reached its highest tempo of the entire war. In Antwerp, Le Havre, and Cherbourg, over 80,000 tons of food were unloaded every week. Cargo ships carried frozen meat from Argentina, flour from Canada, and canned fruit from California. Each shipment fed soldiers thousands of miles away, proof that distance was no longer a barrier. By May 1945, the U.S. Army was feeding over 8 million people a day. Soldiers, allies, and civilians alike. It was not glamorous work. Few medals were given, but historians would later call it the greatest logistical achievement in history. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the world celebrated victory. Yet among those celebrations, in the quiet corners of Europe, the cooks and drivers of the Quartermaster Corps simply kept working, delivering breakfast to soldiers, still guarding bridges, still cleaning up battlefields, still waiting to go home. They knew the war might end on paper, but the hunger did not. Their mission was not only to feed victory, but to sustain peace. With Germany defeated and Japan still fighting across the Pacific, the U.S. Army's logistical machine faced one final test, feeding victory on two fronts. In Europe, trains and trucks continued to roll eastward into the ruined cities of the Third Reich. In Asia, fleets of ships steamed westward across the Pacific, carrying supplies for the final push toward Japan. Each operation demanded precision, speed, and humanity. The Pacific Campaign was still raging: Okinawa, Iwo Jima, the Philippines. And through it all, American logistics remained relentless. Floating kitchens worked from converted tank landing ships. Field bakeries produced bread in the shadow of volcanoes. In tropical heat, refrigeration units hummed day and night to keep food safe. Engineers built entire refrigeration barges that followed fleets across the ocean. A mobile cold chain decades ahead of its time. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, logistics once again became salvation. Across Asia and the Pacific, millions of people faced famine. From China to the Philippines, American supply officers now turned their skills to feeding the world. Cargo ships that once carried ammunition were repurposed for grain. Trucks that once carried shells now hauled rice and flour. In Europe, the Quartermaster Corps helped launch the first large-scale humanitarian relief in modern history. Under Allied supervision, the same networks that had sustained combat troops were used to distribute food, clothing, and medicine to civilians. Warehouses filled with wartime rations became depots for reconstruction aid. The field kitchen became a symbol not of war, but of recovery. Many of these systems would later evolve into the foundation for post-war organizations, including the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, and, eventually, the Marshall Plan. The methods perfected during the war, from food preservation to cold chain logistics, reshaped how nations thought about global supply. Companies like General Foods, Kellogg's, and Heinz took wartime innovations and brought them to the civilian market. Canned meals, powdered milk, and instant coffee. Once made for soldiers in foxholes, now filled American homes. In this transformation, the Quartermaster Corps quietly changed the modern world. The war had proven a profound truth. Logistics could win battles, but it could also build peace. The ability to feed millions, swiftly, efficiently, and humanely became a form of power as vital as any weapon. By 1946, American field kitchens had served nearly 6 billion hot meals across every theater of war. It was a number so vast that even the generals struggled to comprehend it. But for the cooks and drivers who lived it, the meaning was simple. Each meal had kept a man alive, given him strength, and reminded him that he mattered. And in the ashes of cities once at war, those same cooks helped feed hungry children who, just months before, had been the enemy. The logistics of war had become the logistics of humanity. That quiet legacy, born in the mud of Normandy and the sands of North Africa, would outlast the guns, the battles, and even the war itself. For the United States, it was the dawn of a new kind of strength. A strength measured not just in firepower, but in the power to deliver hope. When historians speak of World War II, they often mention battles: Normandy, Midway, Stalingrad. They speak of tanks, planes, generals, and treaties. But behind every headline of victory was something quieter, steadier, and far more human: a meal served on time. The story of how the United States Army fed millions of men across oceans is not one of glory or gunfire. It is a story of precision, planning, and relentless care. It is the story of men who never held rifles but carried ladles, who faced not enemy bullets but exhaustion, mud, and endless miles of supply roads. Each hot meal delivered to the front line was more than calories. It was connection. It told a soldier that somewhere, far from the cold and chaos, there was a system that remembered him. A system that valued his survival as much as his courage. That invisible bond from the factory worker in Kansas to the cook in Normandy became the soul of America's war machine. It wasn't only about feeding an army. It was about proving that even in the darkest chapters of history, organization could serve humanity. From those lessons would grow the modern science of global logistics. The same systems that today deliver medicine to disaster zones, food to famine regions, and relief to war-torn nations. World War II showed that power was not only measured in bombs and steel, but in supply chains, in the ability to sustain life across impossible distances. And long after the last kitchen closed and the final ration was served, that legacy remained, that true strength is not just in the will to fight, but in the will to feed.